Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacco. How should we make sense of Nigeria's 21st century identity? Newly anointed as Africa's #1 economy, it is an oil-rich emerging power. But it's also beset by corruption, poor governance, and a wave of internal conflict that could threaten the very unity of the state. Well, my guest today is the highly acclaimed Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Her fiction explores her country's troubled past and current challenges. How does this writer see Nigeria's story unfolding? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
You have described what Nigeria is going through today, the security crisis, as the most violent period in our nation's existence since the Biafra War. Do you feel the crisis matches Biafra in terms of its challenge to Nigeria?
No.
Because?
Because it's trying to compare what was clearly a civil war with two clearly armed sides, and two in some ways clear sides, which largely knew what they were fighting for. Whether or not that was a good thing, but it's hard to compare that with what's going on now, which I think is just more amorphous and more... So no, I don't think I can compare it, I don't think I can draw parallels, but I do think, though, is that since Biafra, I don't think that anything else has shaken our sense of security as a people.
Before we get to what is happening today, I do want to explore Biafra a little bit with you, because it seems so much to have shaped your creative life, your writing life, but also your personal life, your family history as well. And perhaps we should start by reminding people exactly what happened in that period, the war of 67 to 70. The eastern region of Nigeria fought for secession, for independence. It wanted to be a new nation, Biafra, to leave the young Nigeria behind. And your family was very much caught up in that.
Yes, my father, my parents lived through the war. My grandfathers died in the war.
As fighters or just as...
No, they died in refugee camps. They died, they got ill, and they died because there was no medicine in the refugee camps. My father was one of the many academics who supported the secession and who fought for the cause in their own way. So my father worked in a directorate. My mother, you know, at the time, everybody was very much invested in the win the war effort. So it was, in the beginning, the secession was a cause that cut across class, and also to an extent ethnicity, because there were other smaller ethnic groups in Biafra. But then towards the end of the war, it wasn't the case. Many people were just, I mean, the war had not only destroyed lives, but I like to say that the war robbed a generation of its innocence.
I suppose what it also did was raise questions about the coherence, the sort of fundamental integrity of this very new state of Nigeria, which in some ways was a sort of post-colonial construct. And I wonder if, as a young girl, learning about it with your family, whether you were encouraged to feel Nigerian, or whether you were encouraged to feel, first and foremost, Igbo, your people, your tribe.
No, I was Nigerian and Igbo. I think the idea of ethnicity and of an ethnic identity being somehow mutually exclusive with a nationalist identity really doesn't apply, at least not in my life.
Well, except that in Biafra, you know, I don't know, obviously, how committed your grandparents and parents were to the idea of an independent Biafra, but many Igbo wanted no more part of Nigeria.
Well, yes, but that was because there were political things that had happened, that because in Nigeria ethnicity has for so long been politicized, so that the political decisions that are taken and they target particular ethnic groups. But I don't think that children are raised, certainly wasn't raised to think you're Igbo first, you're Nigerian second. I was both at the same time. And in many ways, I think identity is something that shifts often, depending on where you are. So there are times, and actually depending on what you're doing. And so there are times when I'm more Igbo than anything else, and there are times when I'm more Nigerian than anything else. But I've never thought of both as competing identities, because they're not, for me.
Yeah, Chinua Achebe, one of Nigeria's great writers, the late Chinua Achebe, he's said before he died that, you know, he was very disappointed that Nigerians were no longer learning enough, he felt, about the reasons for the war of 67 to 70. It wasn't being taught in schools, he felt, in the right way. And therefore, I think he felt that important lessons to be learned were not being learned by today's Nigerians. Now, your book, Half a Yellow Sun, is you know, all about what happened and tracing a family through what happened. Do you share his feelings?
Yes, but it's actually not something new. Nigeria as a country has never really engaged with Biafra. But I also don't think it's that surprising, though, because countries in general hide parts of their history that they're ashamed of, or that they're uncertain about. There's a lot that's unresolved from that period in our history. And so while I think it's wrong, I don't think it's terribly surprising that I didn't learn very much about the Nigeria-Biafra War in school, for example. And having grown up the daughter of people who survived the war, people who were actually, you know, deeply wounded by that war, I didn't know very much either, because they didn't really talk about it. It's
very interesting for me to imagine what your father then made of you committing so much of your time and effort as a young writer to exploring that past. And I just wonder what he made of the end product.
My father is a lovely man, and I'm very much a daddy's girl. And, you know, both my parents didn't talk about that period because it was very difficult for them. And they didn't talk about it until I started to ask questions. And I really cannot explain in an intellectual way why I was haunted by that period. But I have been since I was 13. And I would ask questions endlessly. And, you know, my father, particularly my father, he was generous enough to tell me what he had gone through. And many of the stories he told me formed the basis of the novel, Half of a Yellow Sun. And I remember when I finished it, I was very worried about what he would think. And so what I did was, I was at home in Nsukka with them, and then I left the manuscript on his study table, and then the next day I left and went to Lagos.
You ran away?
Yes, and I didn't want him to read it when I was there. And then I asked my brother to go check on Daddy and see what his expression was like when he was reading. But I have to say my father approved. And he also said that he was very taken by how I had used the details that he had provided.
The movie version of Half of a Yellow Sun, which is obviously out in the UK and many Western countries, hasn't actually been certified, hasn't been given a certificate for release in Nigeria. Is that, do you think, because, again, Nigerians and the authorities don't want to be confronted with the divisions, the tensions, the fragmentation that lies potentially within the country?
Well, I think our leadership is very much aware of the fragmentations in Nigeria. I don't think they need a film to remind them of that.
Well,
I do think, though, I don't know. I think that everybody's on edge in Nigeria at the moment, just because of Boko Haram. And it's not that surprising that because we're all on edge, people overreact. And so there's a film, and it's about Biafra, and Biafra is based on a very turbulent part of our history, and certain people in certain positions get frightened, and they think maybe we shouldn't let people see this. But I think that's, I think it's a shame, really, because the film isn't even very political. The novel is much more political than the film, and it's really just a beautiful romantic film. And what's sad, I think, is that by doing this, they have politicized it, and now there are people who are probably going to watch the film looking for something to be offended by.
Well, that was then, and Biafra did so much to shape that sort of early period of Nigeria's history. Today, as you've just mentioned, Boko Haram is perhaps the sort of biggest challenge to Nigeria's sort of unity and stability. Would you yourself, as you live at least part of your life in Nigeria and in Lagos, would you look at Boko Haram and think there is something there which is an expression of sort of alienation, of inequality, of deep socio-economic problems in my country, or do you not see it as an expression of that?
Well, I don't think the answer is that simple. I mean, I do think that socioeconomic inequality is part of the problem. I don't think it is the problem. And I say this because, you know, poverty is a problem that cuts across the country. It's not something that is particular to the Northeast.
Except if you look at the figures, it is striking the degree to which absolute poverty is clearly highest in the North and Northeast.
Well, but I think we should ask the question why. I mean, Nigeria is a federation, right? So, and we have this very interesting sort of revenue allocation formula, which means that many northern states actually get more money than southern states. And so when we talk about poverty in the North and the Northeast, well, I think it's important to remember that, yes, there are many people who are poor, but the northern governments are not necessarily poor. And then I suppose one needs to ask why. I think part of the narrative, and this is something that seems to exist more outside Nigeria than in Nigeria, is that Boko Haram is a result of sort of a certain kind of socioeconomic neglect of that part of the country by the government. But you know, while I think the government bears a lot of responsibility, I think when you really look at the way Nigeria works and the way the states get their money, it's not true at all that area should be necessarily much poorer than.
Well, and then the other way to look at Boko Haram, apart from those sort of deep-lying socio-economic factors, is to take seriously its specific message, which, you know, is against modernity. You know, literally it means against sort of Western education, and quite clearly with the most high-profile, shocking tactic they've adopted, that is abducting the schoolgirls, in particular in Chibok, abducting more than 200 schoolgirls in one go. They seem to be delivering a message directly against the education of females, against sort of any progressive liberal view of gender equality in Nigeria. Is that, do you think, at the heart of what they are about?
No, I don't think so. I think they're delivering a message about Western education. And I don't think it's as gendered.
You don't see it as a gender issue?
No, because if it was, then they wouldn't have murdered all those innocent boys that they murdered in their school. I mean, this is a group that has attacked both boys and girls. The abduction of the girls, I think there's something cynical about it. I suppose that we live in a world where gender still matters very much, and you make a bigger point if you abduct girls, I think. And also, just more cynically, that you can use them as sex slaves. So I don't think that Boko Haram is necessarily about not educating girls. I think Boko Haram is about Western-style education somehow being a bad thing.
What about the reaction to the abducting of the girls? I mean, we know Boko Haram, anybody who follows Nigeria knows it's been around a long time, for 5 years, and the violence has been endemic in certain parts of the country for a long time. But something about that Chibok event has captured the world's imagination with all of the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign and everything else, which started in Nigeria but really gained traction when Michelle Obama and others got involved as well. Do you wonder sometimes what it is that the West sees in this particular event? I just wonder how you see it.
Fortunately, I'm not a member of the West, so we might have to ask the West.
No, but you have a unique position in a way, because you spend half your time in the United States and a lot of your time still in Nigeria. And you, in a sense, you've got a foot in both worlds.
Actually, I spend more than half in Nigeria now. But, you know, I don't know. I have thought about it. And I think there's a sense in which it's a story that fits into certain expectations of what should happen in a place like Nigeria. It's also a story that is easy to connect to emotionally without necessarily knowing what the political context is. And I think, and one of the things that I think has happened is because of the emotional weight of the story, it's often been constructed in ways that I find interesting, such as the idea that it's really just like the Taliban, because that fits a prefabricated box of But it isn't, right? It really isn't, and it's complex in its own way. But at the same time, I think that, I think that the attention that has, the very Nigerian grassroots social media campaign that then sort of spread across the world, in some ways I think it was useful because it did make, I think it made the Nigerian government sit up a little bit more. I think it made them think of the abductions less as a local political thing, which is what I think they had seen it as, and made them sort of think of it as something more global. And if that will bring the girls back, which is the hope, then I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. You say you don't see it through the sort of prism of gender, but I do want to pursue a bit of a gender discussion with you, because you've made a very clear point of saying you are a feminist, and you rather amusingly said, you know what, I'm a happy African feminist, and some African women may not believe that's possible because they assume that if you're a feminist, you're not happy because you haven't found the right husband, or you're not really African because you've been so influenced by Western thinking.
Yes.
So you tell me, how easy is it in today's Nigeria to be a feminist?
Well, I don't know about easy. It's what I am, and it's what I will die as a feminist. And and the idea that feminism is somehow a Western import is very troubling to me because it's untrue.
But many Nigerian women, you've said, one Nigerian academic came up to you not so long ago and said, "Oh, that's not our culture. Feminism is not us."
That is true, but I think that's because the idea of feminism is very limited by a single story. That there's a stereotype of feminism. People think if you're feminist, it means, even in the West, it means you don't shave and you don't use deodorant and you burn bras and that kind of nonsense. And I was a child who just didn't understand why boys were supposed to be more important than I was. And I didn't read any books to come to that conclusion. I just found it silly. I was in primary school, I was doing better than the boys, and somehow a boy had to be the class monitor. And I remember just thinking, well, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, we really should focus on ability, right? We should have the best person be. But in general, it's not an easy thing to talk about gender, and I think that's the case everywhere in the world, but in Nigeria in particular. But it's something that I think is important because, because it's important. It's a question of...
I wonder the extent to which it automatically makes you a campaigner, because, again, interesting quote from you. You said, if it's true that the full humanity of women is not our culture, sort of taking on that argument you hear in Nigeria, then we must make it our culture, which suggests to me that, you have a real commitment now to sort of changing Nigeria.
Well, that sounds very grand. I don't think my ambitions are that. Well, I think I have a bit of a messiah complex. I have to confess to this. I do want to work for a better world, and I think that gender injustice is one way to do that.
So where do you start? I mean, I'm just thinking, for example...
We start, and it's doable. Here's the thing, I really do think it's doable. People have used culture as a way of closing down debate. People have used culture to say, well, it's not our culture, therefore women have to accept it as their lot. And my position is that culture is constantly changing, and that if you came to Igbo land in Nigeria, where I'm from, 100 years ago, and you had twins, the twins would be killed because Igbo culture felt that twins were somehow abnormal. Now, 100 years later, all Igbo people would be horrified at the thought of killing twins.
What about, fascinating. Let me ask you another question, which may be relevant to the Igbo tradition and culture, that is, female genital mutilation, or as some still call it, female circumcision. Across Nigeria, that's been pervasive for generations.
Not in my part.
Well, maybe in the Igbo tradition that was never...
My part of Igbo land, no.
Right.
I'm not familiar with it. We didn't do it. My mother didn't, my grandmother didn't.
But I did notice, looking at the figures, that across eastern Nigeria, the figures were 50% and more traditionally of women were going through that experience. So here's the question. If that, to some Nigerians, still represents tradition and culture, do you feel that, that there is an absolute right here for a modern Nigerian woman to say, no, that is, as the UN have said and so many other institutions, that is just plain unacceptable and wrong?
Yes, of course, because culture changes. I mean, the idea, what I believe in very much is the idea that change has to come from within the culture. And there are many women, I mean, there are figures, but there are many women in those societies who object to it and who are working to change it. And I don't believe that culture can be used as a reason for any form of injustice. I just don't. And I think that in the end, culture really, what's the point of culture? Right? The culture really should be about preserving the continuity of your people. And I think that today, if we continue to exclude women from many positions of power and also many cultural institutions of power, then at some point we just won't survive.
I said you live sort of half and half, US and Nigeria. You said, no, I spend most of my time in Lagos. The fact that you had a university education in the US, you've spent a lot of time in the US, and I believe your partner is in the US, does that make you, when you come back to Nigeria, and you've written a book called Americana about Nigerians who go away and then come back from the US, does it make you a harsher critic of your country or a more passionate defender?
It's actually interesting. Both. Both. I think what
where would you put the emphasis?
In both.
Well, that's a cheat. I really want. I want to know.
No, I refuse to know. Both, really, because I think both come together for me. What leaving home did for me was that it made me realize how much I loved Nigeria, how just deeply emotionally I am invested in Nigeria, but also how much I realized that we can do better. Because I was looking at it from the outside, and most of the most intelligent, the most innovative people I know are Nigerians. And looking at it from the outside, I find myself thinking, but why are we underperforming? And that then makes me much more likely to complain, which is what I do endlessly when I'm at home. But it's the complaining that comes from a belief that we can do so much better. So I do think it's both, because it's the only country I have, but that's not why I love it. I just happen to love. I am deeply
well, it's not necessarily the only country you have, because you do have ties in the United States now. And I'm interested, because you've written a lot about America, and you've talked about how, as an African woman going to America, it was odd in a way, because there you were defined by your race,
yes,
in a way that you'd never been defined by, yes, obviously, back home. And I just wonder, again, having lived in both cultures and societies, whether you just feel more comfortable in Nigeria than you ever could in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. I grew up in Nigeria. My sensibility is Nigerian. I look at the world through Nigerian eyes. And while I like America very much and I'm comfortable there, it's not mine.
And is that partly because race is a problem in America?
I don't think so. I think if I had been born there and raised there, maybe with all of the problems of race there, I think I probably would consider it mine. So it's not so much about race, it's simply...
But that's partly interesting, because partly that's African Americans, that is black Americans, yes, do, I think, sometimes find it troubling the way in which Africans don't adopt their sort of race perspective.
Yes, because many Africans don't get it. I think there's an assumption that if you're a dark-skinned person, then you automatically understand race. That is the way that race functions in America, but that's not true. And so for me, as a person who went to the US to go to college, and I really had no idea about what it meant, really. I mean, I had read Roots, and I knew intellectually that slavery had happened. But to be in the US and suddenly to hear jokes about watermelon and fried chicken, and to learn that these were supposed to be offensive, I was utterly confused. And then to be expected to be offended by things I didn't necessarily understand was even more disorienting. I mean, I get it all now, but at the time I didn't.
Well, we have to end there. But Chimamanda and Ngozi Adichie, it's been a pleasure having you on Hard Talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.